I wish to call the meeting to order, and can I remind members, please, to turn their mobile phones off while attending the meeting. Apologies have been received from Deputy Kathleen Funchion and Senator Paul Gavan, and I propose to the members, Senator Gallagher, I propose to the members that the committee conducts its public business first and then deals with housekeeping matters in private session. Is that agreed? Agreed. Gurv Malgut. So we are now in public session. And can I remind the members and witnesses, please, again, to turn off their mobile phones or indeed switch them to flight mode, because as we know, mobile phones interfere with the sound system and they make it difficult for the parliamentary reporters to report the meeting, and also television coverage and web streaming will be adversely affected. We are waiting for one of the witnesses, but I'm sure he'll be here soon, and I think that we will go ahead without him. So the purpose of this part of the meeting is to have an engagement in relation to the current use of reduced timetables and to look at the impact on students and the impact on school as a whole, and also to look for recommendations in relation to the practice and in relation to monitoring, because at the moment there isn't any effective monitoring of the practice, and it's actually difficult to have proper data in order to look at it and see about the impact on it. So I think it's going to be a very useful and interesting session. We have had a number of submissions from other bodies also, and we will be having another session on the 13th of June. Following that, the committee will be discussing what we've heard, and we'll be making recommendations to the Minister and to the Department. On behalf of the committee, I wish to welcome, and we're going to have two different groupings, both grouped by thematic submissions. So Mr Patrick Riley, who's a mental health worker in Pave Point Traveller and Roma Centre. You're very welcome, Patrick. Lorraine Dempsey, Information and Policy Officer with the Special Needs Parents Association. Adam Harris, who will be joining us from As I Am. Maria Joyce, Coordinator of National Traveller Women's Forum, and Mark O'Connor, Community Engagement Manager with Inclusion Ireland. So we're going to hear your submissions first. We have had the opportunity to read what you've sent us beforehand. We're also joined by Kieran Golden, President of the National Association of Principal and Deputy Principals, Mr Pat Goff, CEO of Irish Primary Principals Network, Ms Breda Corr, General Secretary of the National Association of Boards of Management and Special Education, and Dr Michael Redmond, Director of Research and Development in the Joint Managerial Body Secretariat of Secondary Schools. So I propose to take Group 1 first, and they're those that are on the top tier. Then we will have engagement with the members, and then we'll hear from the bottom tier of stakeholders. So the format of the meeting is that I will invite you to make a brief opening statement. Can I ask you please to stick to the maximum time of 3 minutes, because we do have a number of people to listen to, and obviously we want to afford the members an opportunity to comment and to ask questions also. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of your evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by myself as Chair to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statements that you have made to the committee will be published on the committee website after the meeting. And I want to remind members also of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Also just to point out that in terms of the engagement that we have today, if you feel there is anything that you want to add to it, to your own submission later on, please feel free to do that in a written form to the clerk, and Anna will make sure that all the members are circulated with that, and we'll take all of those extra comments on board when we're looking at reporting our findings and our recommendations. So I would now like to call on Patrick Riley, please, to give the first submission.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Good morning, dear members of the committee. ParvyPoint would like to thank the committee for this opportunity to make this statement today. I'm here to speak about the serious concerns ParvyPoint has about the impact of inappropriate use of reduced timetables on traveller children and make recommendations to this committee. Context first, the overall shocking and poor education outcomes for travellers were recently discussed at this committee. According to the ESRI, 13% of travellers complete secondary education compared to 92% of the settled population. We are concerned that the use of reduced timetables will serve to further reinforce these negative outcomes. ParvyPoint has received a number of reports from traveller parents about the inappropriate use of reduced timetables. These reports indicate that reduced timetables are being used outside of their original purpose, mainly as a behavioural management tool. However, there is no official documentation available about its use other than the reports made to us. What is clear is that the use of reduced timetables is having a negative impact on the educational progression of traveller children, as well as a wider impact on their well-being. Parents report worries over children falling behind in their education and children being frustrated when they do not understand what is being taught. Parents are not always equipped to support their children and look to as being expected to cover the hours their children should be in school. We have not received an adequate response to this issue from the Department of Education and Skills nor TUSLA. Therefore, the question arises as to whose responsibility is it to monitor its use. If the responsibility lies with the individual school board of management, then appropriate structures to ensure that the tool of reduced timetables is not used outside of its remits needs to be developed. The recommendations, ParvyPoint makes the following recommendations to address this situation. The use of reduced timetables should be strictly monitored through a defined mechanism. When reduced timetables are implemented, a notice should be sent to the Department of Education and the National Council for Special Education. This notice must include clear rationale for its use, length of time, plan to support the young person to return to the school timetable, their age and ethnicity. The notice must be signed by the Board of Management and have attained parental consent. Parents must also consent to the data being used to document the use of reduced timetables. The Inspectorate should identify a mechanism to capture the use of limited and reduced timetables when carrying out school inspections. Undertake an audit of the application of limited reduced timetables with traveller children and publish its report. The Department of Education and Skills should issue a circular to schools advising that limited reduced timetables can only be used in very limited and time-bound circumstances. Publish disaggregated data on the basis of ethnicity in secondary schools to monitor participation and outcomes of traveller and Roma students. Provide funding to independent traveller organisations to advocate for traveller education needs and address educational inequalities. Put in place additional ring-fenced educational supports for traveller pupils. And finally, Department of Justice and Equality should develop a robust implementation plan for the National Travel Inclusion Strategy with clear targets, indicators, outcomes and budget lines, particularly to promote the inclusion of travellers in education. Replicate the new traveller education pilot project across the country and ensure it is adequately resourced and sustained into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And now I turn to Lorraine. And indeed, Lorraine, I know in a previous session you referred to that particular issue here, but this is the first time that we are looking at it in total. So over to you, Lorraine.
Chairperson, Deputies and Senators, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to present on this issue today on behalf of Special Needs Parents Association. And indeed, it isn't the first reference to a restricted school timetable, but it is the first time that it is the sole focus to be able to examine this and to provide solutions for it. The issue of reduced timetables has been brought to the attention of the Department of Education and Skills and the National Council for Special Education over previous years, but little by way of data is available on how prevalent the use of reduced timetables is in our educational settings. The latest figures from TUSLA indicate that 117,000 post-primary pupils have missed 20 or more days in school in the last school year, but we have little or no idea of how significant a figure is for reduced timetables, or whether some schools are adopting this approach more frequently than others. All the evidence that we have is primarily anecdotal from parents who would be contacting us where the situation is imposed on them by a school. There are other situations where it's a voluntary reduced timetable for the benefit of the pupil, and we're not taking issue with that. TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, do not proactively engage early on when children are on a restricted school timetable and are restricted from accessing the school environment and the curriculum by the school. But they will take action against parents when they deem that they are responsible for restricting access. TUSLA have indicated that there is no legislation to support the use of reduced timetables, and the constitutionality of imposing such a reduced timetable is questionable. The main reason that we have experienced to date where reduced timetables are used is where the school states that there's not the required resources to support a child, in particular an SNA to cater for the child's needs, and the child's access to school is thereby limited by the availability of this support. This is often in contention with the opinion of the SENO, or Special Educational Needs Organiser, when contacted by the parent, and thus the child is stuck in the middle of conflicting opinions and loses out both educationally and socially. In similar circumstances, a child's behaviour is typically the primary reason cited. But there is an ongoing question of whether an SNA is the most appropriate support for a child where behavioural management is required. Minister McHugh has stated that reduced timetables should not be used as a behavioural management technique or as a de facto suspension or expulsion. Article 24 of the UN CRPD stipulates that children with disabilities are not to be excluded from free and compulsory primary education on the basis of disability, and goes on to say that persons with disabilities receive the support required within the general education system to facilitate their effective education. Article 30 of the UN CRPD also states that all state parties, which in this case means Ireland as we've now ratified the Convention, should ensure that children with disabilities have equal access with other children to participation in play, recreation, leisure and sporting activities, including those activities in school. The cost of reduced timetables on parents, as well as the emotional cost, is of particular concern in relation to the risks to parents' employment, and this is rarely a consideration of the school when imposing reduced timetables, but indeed it is a reality for some families. In conclusion, the use of reduced timetables should be of last resort, time-bound, reported to the Department, monitored and triggered a multi-agency response that will involve a holistic review and the response and impact and risks associated with the reduced timetable for both the child and family. Our key points that we'd like to get across to the committee, which are furthered in our written submission, is that the child has a constitutional right to an education regardless of where that education takes place, and we would propose that a supplemental scheme be put in place to support a child in their education when on a reduced school timetable because they don't qualify for home tuition. And this would further put them at an educational disadvantage when they do try and reintegrate back into a full school day. We are not targeting schools for the blame in cases where reduced timetables are of last resort, but the Department must step up and support our schools appropriately. Again, as of every other year when we're presenting to the committee, we have to raise the issue of the lack of therapeutic interventions and the very long waiting lists for CAMS and the Children's Disability Network teams. And indeed, this time last year, I mentioned to the committee that the last Children's Disability Network team to be formed was in 2014, and a year on, we're still in that same situation. When all else has failed and the child can't cope in the school environment, we're not opposed to the use of the agreed use of school timetables, but we do require wraparound supports for both the child and family in that setting.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine. Adam still hasn't arrived, so I'm just proposing that we would take you next, Maria. So Maria Joyce is the coordinator of the National Traveller Women's Forum and has been with us before also. You're welcome, Maria.
Thank you very much. And we also welcome the opportunity to speak before the committee today on this issue of reduced timetables as they impact on traveller children. First, there is no clear policy or guidelines on how this practice of reduced timetables is deployed in Ireland, and the issue of reduced timetables as they impact on traveller pupils, and we know that they are an issue for other groups also, has become a major concern. We have raised concerns in relation to this issue to the NITRAS Steering Committee and also directly with the Department of Education and Skills. There is no, as has already been said, data or collated information available on the practice of reduced timetables in schools. And I just want to take the opportunity to outline a number of a small selection of examples of concerns raised by local traveller organisations. Traveller organisations have witnessed a huge regression in traveller education since the cuts to educational supports for travellers during the recession, and the issue of traveller children on reduced hours has almost reached a point where it has become policy rather than exception for a child with particular needs. It is resorted to far too easily, not as a last resort, and there needs to be documented evidence of the efforts by schools clearly given before reduced timetables are put in place, with a platter of safeguards in that process. We believe that instead of placing traveller children on reduced hours, the schools need to look at the root causes of traveller children's unhappiness in a system that doesn't recognise, value or celebrate their unique culture and identity. Reduced timetables have been implemented while young travellers are placed on waiting lists for psychological and educational assessments. As waiting times can be quite lengthy, this places traveller children on reduced timetables for prolonged periods of time without any additional supports put in place. When this is challenged by traveller organisations with schools, they have said the reason is limited resources. However, reduced hours in school is often the complete opposite as to what is needed by students, with the argument being put that it is in fact increased supports that is required. Challenging reduced timetables can often come with a reference to poor attendance. The point appears contradictory. Local traveller organisations are trying to support the attendance, achievement and attainment of young travellers in education. This can be difficult if reduced hours is seen as a direct response to addressing poor attendance. This only adds to the problem because their absence in school leaves them further behind academically and adds to resistance to attend. The children should be provided with extra support, one-to-one support, resource hours and some system that takes into account the child's additional needs. Reduced timetables for traveller children in primary school has a double negative impact. Losing out on an education in primary school, but are expected to go into post-primary and deal with increased subjects, multiple teachers on a daily basis for a much longer day. It's an absolute given that these children will fall out of the system, and we do see it as another form of segregated provision, albeit in a different name. Travellers appear to be placed in this situation disproportionately to the wider community. In terms of positive implementation of reduced timetables in individual cases, we do see how reduced timetables might support young students with an illness or a medical condition, and this could mean the difference between receiving an education or not. However, in terms of traveller children, it's been put in place without that kind of reason or logic. And it's also, as has been said, a reason to manage behaviour and certainly is feeding into the low expectations. In terms of recommendations, an independent investigation should be undertaken by the Ombudsman for Children, and a clear picture of the nature and extent of the use of reduced timetables is needed urgently, including the reasons for and the consequences of it for traveller children. Department of Education and Skills need to develop clear guidelines and protocols with human rights and equality ethos for schools and parents in consultations with stakeholders on with the rationale for an appropriate use of reduced timetables, and this should be given statutory basis. Guidelines must contain a clear outline of the process of complaint if a parent is dissatisfied with the practice of reduced timetables as it relates to their child. Yes. Schools should be obliged to provide clear data on their use of reduced timetables. Again, the segregated data on traveller pupils is important here, and there is a role for the Department of Education, the Education Welfare Service, TUSLA, and the Inspectorate. And also, just to say, the broader recommendations in relating to supporting the inclusion, participation and attainment levels of traveller pupils are also of key relevance here, and that needs to be supported, and traveller organisations and parents supported with that. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Maria. And as always, it is helpful to get practical recommendations from all of you as well. And our final speaker then in session 1 is Mark O'Connor, who's the Community Engagement Manager with Inclusion Ireland. Over to you, Mark.
Chair from Deputy Senator of Inclusion Ireland welcomes the Joint Committee on Education Skills invitation to speak here today on the current use of reduced timetables in schools. Evidence from our work suggests the use of reduced timetables is a relatively common but hidden practice that impacts negatively on the education and well-being of children with disabilities and their families. In 2018, Inclusion Ireland published a discussion paper shining a light on seclusion and restraint in schools. One parent described her child missing a combined 100 school days in the same school year, while another parent described waiting in the school car park as the phone would start ringing to collect her child from as early as 9 or 10 past 9 a.m. A number of years back, Inclusion Ireland previously conducted a survey of parents who had a child on a reduced timetable. Almost 2/3 of the children were in school for less than 3 hours a day, with a very worrying 12% only receiving 1 hour of school per day or less. A significant majority of these children were on a reduced timetable for more than 12 weeks, and this included some of the children who were in school for less than 1 hour per day. Several parents disclosed how they were forced to accept their child being put on a reduced timetable, or the school would move to expel the child. Other parents spoke of not agreeing to a reduced timetable and the school calling them as early as 9:10 at the slightest hint of an incident, and the parent would arrive and the child, everything seemed to be fine with the child. Very few of the parents were aware of any assistance they could avail of when their child was put on a reduced timetable, such as the Section 29 appeal under the Education Act, or the services of an Education and Welfare Officer. Through our casework, parents tell us of the stress, the shame and the distress the child feels, and the huge financial burden that families are put under, as they quite often have to give up work and apply for a social welfare payment such as carers allowance. Schools often cite a lack of resources or the child's inability to cope with a full school day when suspending a child in this manner. Many teachers, however, we know have no specialist training, nor are they required to have specialist training to teach children with disabilities. There's very poor access to therapeutic services, including speech and language therapy, which has already been mentioned. These therapies can assist children to address their sensory and communication needs in a more appropriate manner than through some of the behaviour that may lead to a reduced timetable. But possibly the most critical factor is the failure to commence the parts of the Education of Persons with Special Education Needs Act that will benefit children with disabilities. Shamefully, this Act was passed by this House 15 years ago, but remains not commenced. So I've outlined some of the problem and some of the causes, and now recommend a few possible solutions and helps. These hidden suspensions and the harsh suspensions via a reduced timetable must be ceased. All children with a disability or learning need must have access to an appropriately trained teacher. Teachers should have access to more robust undergrad training in the area of special education needs, and those that are working in the area of special ed could also avail of significant continuous professional development. The HSE must be funded to recruit additional therapists as a matter of urgency to address the huge waiting lists that have been mentioned already. Children in schools should be able to access therapy on a universal basis through the new NCSE school inclusion model being piloted. Upon a successful pilot stage, the model should be resourced and rolled out nationally. Schools must be directed to collect data and report on children who are suspended via a reduced timetable. The Oireachtas must review the Education Act of 1998 regulations that allow for an independent appeal relating to reduced timetables before the cumulative 20-day period. And finally, the Department of Education and Skills must be asked to produce a plan to commence the 15-year-old EPSIN Act. This will ensure children with disabilities are appropriately supported in school through assessments, appropriate support and individual education plans. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mark. I'm now going to go to the members, and Deputy Thomas Byrne has indicated.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks everyone for being here today. Unfortunately, I have another meeting to attend, so we'll have to leave shortly. May not hear the second half, but I have to say, there's there's a number of groups represented here today, but it's travellers and children with special needs are represented here, and that's where the problem is. I raised this issue in the Dáil last November. I raised it then after some of the traveller groups into this committee before since then. One thing I think is wrong when people say there's no clear policy on this. There is a clear policy on this. The Constitution of Ireland guarantees the right to free primary education to every child. That's the clear policy. And I think we have to start from that position, that is a clear policy that must be implemented by government. And I would say this for the Minister, and I don't always agree with them, but in the questions that I have asked in the Dáil, the policy could not be clearer that this is not acceptable. It couldn't be clearer. But unfortunately, the message hasn't got out to schools that this isn't acceptable. The Minister has made it absolutely clear that the position is that all pupils who are enrolled in a school should attend school for the full day unless exempted from doing so for exceptional circumstances such as medical reasons. There's no ifs, no buts, nothing. This is not acceptable and has to end, and the Minister needs to maybe more clearly state this other than in written answers in the Dáil, which in fairness is a very clear way of setting out the position. There is no doubt that when this happens, that it is a suspension and should be followed up, and parents need to be empowered to know that the Section 29 procedure is there. I've come across this on a number of occasions recently, and colleagues asking me what the position is. The position is very clear. And also I think that when parents are asked to collect children early, they should ask for it in writing, and I think you'll find that schools will be very reluctant to give it in writing because they've no grounds to do so whatsoever. And I would certainly ask for that if I was a parent in a situation like this. A more drastic action, and one parent would have to consider, is just simply to ignore the call. But that's very difficult because there may be an issue, maybe a medical issue, whatever. But I take huge issue with this idea that there's no clear policy, and I think we need to really not accept that as the position. It's very, very clear children are entitled to go to school, and it is clearly an issue for children with disabilities and children from traveller ethnicity. So I don't have a huge amount more to say, but I really hope that this committee and what we're hearing today is going to spur this on, that this, as has been described as silent suspensions, that this hearing today helps it come to an end, because it has to end. And I think that what the Minister said in my last question of the Dáil, he said this last November as well, that he's engaging with TUSLA on this issue, and that needs to happen. TUSLA, that section of TUSLA probably needs to be merged into the department. Look, I have no further questions. That's my position, it's my party's position. It seems to be the government position as well, and I think schools very much need to get the message. That's obviously, they need the support, services and all of that, that's clear. But the fundamental right there is the right to education. It is in the Constitution. It's the only right that costs money that's in the Constitution, very, very clearly set down.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Byrne. Deputy Martin.
And thank you very much. It may seem to be the government's position, but that's simply not good enough, because it's not enough for the minister to reply to a parliamentary question or say it in the Dáil. He should have written, and the previous minister should have given a direction to all schools that this simply cannot happen. There's a lack of oversight. It's happening behind closed doors. Children are not getting that constitutional right to education. So we need clarity straight away from the minister, a directive to schools. That this cannot continue to happen. I have a number of questions. I'm just wondering, when students are put on a reduced timetable, how are the teachers selected to teach, and what is their training? Be it with their training with disability, teaching children with disability, or their training with children with behavioural difficulties. Is there ever a case where there isn't a teacher there and it's an SNA who is burdened with this without the teacher? Do whole school, in relation to the monitoring or assessment of this, or the oversight that's needed for a whole school evaluation or an MLL or an incidental, the drive-by inspections, does the inspector ever ask, say for the incidental, and is there a child on a reduced timetable day? I'd like to come in and to see that and see how that's been managed. Because if that's not happening, that needs to be on the list of the inspector, so that they know when they go into school they need to check immediately. Apart from what's happening in CSP or English or history or Irish or PE, is there a child on a reduced timetable, because we need to see what's happening with that. And I suspect that's not the case, but I just want that clarified. And are we saying that there are zero guidelines from the Department of Education? Is that the case? What is, in any studies or research you've done, what is the maximum amount of time or weeks that a child is, can this go on indefinitely, that a child has been deprived of education? When schools decide we're putting a child on a reduced timetable, how do they decide what subjects that child should be exposed to? Like, I presume PE, art, music, anything where you have, that social element that is needed in those subjects, are they just completely excluded from that? You will not get PE, despite there's a childhood obesity crisis in this country. You will not get art, you will not get music, you will not get woodwork. Oh, we definitely couldn't let that child into woodwork. Is that what's happening? Completely zero? Like, it's so appalling from the full development and well-being of our children, what we're doing. What happens at break time? Are they completely excluded? They do not. Is that part of their reduced timetable if they're there between, say, 9 and 12, but they don't go on the break with the other children between 11 and 11:15? Has that been examined, the impact of that? Have we established the view of teachers? Have teachers been anonymously surveyed? What they think about it? And when the surveys happen in the MLL or the whole school evaluation, you know, the surveys of the students and teachers, is that a question? I think teachers should be surveyed. Is reduced timetable happening in your school? How do you think that's working for the benefit of the student? I think that needs to be included as well. Of course, I don't believe that reduced timetable should be happening at all. That is the issue. But if we're continuing with it, it needs to be tackled straight away. But be clear, I'm completely against reduced timetable. Has the department done any research? Again, if the Minister's saying this should not happen, but I haven't given a directive to the schools to make sure it doesn't happen, what alternatives are there for a child? Has that been looked at? What do other countries do when there's an issue with behavioural difficulties? Surely they're not saying we're going to take education away from you and we're going to take all these subjects away from you. What percentage of students who've been put on reduced timetables return to the full timetables? Or is it just a way of getting them out of the school eventually? Because it becomes so difficult for the parents to manage with the phone calls, can you come get your child at such a time, and they're in full-time employment. And it just makes the child themselves feel so less a part of the school community that they move away. So what percentage is there? And in the reduced timetable, do we know if they're getting any counselling, even from the guidance counsellor? There's a whole, it's just wrong on so many levels. And I think what we should get out of today from shining the light, and we need the Minister to write to the schools to put an end to this. And we need research done to put the proper alternatives in place to give support to our children with disabilities, to give support with our children who enter school already with a type of alienation and segregation going on, and then we put them, let's make it worse, and put them into a room on their own without the proper educational supports. But those questions there in relation to how it's been monitored, assessed, it's zero, or what can we do?
Thank you, Deputy. Senator Ruane.
Yeah, so I mean, I know Deputy Byrne said there's two groups, but I think it is being used as well on kids that have either are not from the travelling background and also don't actually have any diagnosis of needs for any sort of special education. So there is a cohort of students that it is explicitly behavioural alongside their traveller pupils as well, and it's all about behavioural, and there's no special education support even there for them, or SNAs there for them, and the suspension or the reduced timetable is seen as a behavioural tool for them. I think my issue really is the fact that there seems to be a lot of issues. First of all, is the lack of data, which has been mentioned. Who actually makes the decision? Right, so who actually makes a decision that it's in the benefit of the child? Because in all the reports that I've had, there's never really been a case conference. I've never had a parent come to me and say that there was, you know, a series of meetings where that student was placed at the centre of the conversation, and whether there's care workers involved, whether the school is involved, whether there's youth clubs involved, whether there's any education support workers involved, whether there's any traveller advocates involved, you know, so the fact that somebody will make an assessment, it's like, based on what actually? Why? How are you saying that this is for the benefit of the child? When in reality, in most cases, and I know in some there might be extreme anxiety, and there might be a situation where a child might need to go home early on a particular day, but not as an indefinite action. I'm wondering who actually is entitled to make that decision, and in relation to the parents that agree to it. You know, is it really fair to say that all parents agree to it, or do they agree to it out of power imbalance and the fear of losing the child's school place? And then the fact that it's not reported to TUSLA seems like a real manipulation, actually, because if they outright suspended the child, it would be reported to TUSLA. And you would see the schools that are actually suspending more children than others. But if they reduce them, it doesn't have to be reported. And that's how we can't collect the data. So there seems to be, in some situations, a concerted effort to hide the fact that reduced timetables are being used as a way to actually just mark the child attendant in the morning and then ringing someone to come and get them, because then that doesn't actually, there's no mechanism kicks in place then. So really, I think more looking at, like, how do you manage or how do you support schools? And I know for me, it's completely different, I know, than the education system, but working as a community worker for so long and supporting women that were in addiction, say, that had lots of different organisations or bodies involved in supporting them maybe with their children in school, we never made decisions on their lives without actually interacting with all the other services that are actually involved in that child's care. Whether it be behavioural stuff in terms of what supports they're receiving in the community, and actually sitting down and making a full holistic needs assessment that's based on everything about that child's life, not just on whether it's going to make the classroom life a little bit easier. So sometimes I think this benefit of the student is used in a way so that parents will actually go, oh, well, it's in the, because then you feel like you're taking responsibility for it when you're actually not measuring whose benefit is actually for. And the fact that we have numerous reports of the misuse of resource hours. So you have children being put on reduced timetables, and then you have SNAs writing to us in bundles about being asked to wash teachers' cars. So you're like going, well, the additional resource hours, why aren't they being used in the adequate way to support more vulnerable groups that need assistance within the school system? The fact that two-thirds, Mark, you said two-thirds of the people in the survey that use carried out receive less than 3 hours of education a day. I mean, over a lifetime, if you measure that up, how many years are people actually missing of education? Are they even getting, past, the educational kind of, age of 12 in primary when they move on, and because I think it mostly happens in secondary when it comes to traveller children, when it comes to behavioural stuff. So really it's about, for me, is how do we actually move forward? How do we enforce the fact that they have to collect data and report it? And obviously how do we stop it? But how do we create a system whereby all the bodies that are involved with that child's life and care actually are making that decision, and that there is real consent around the going or not going of a child to school? Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Senator Gallagher.
As well, I'd like to welcome everybody here this morning. Based on the contributions we've heard so far, and I'm conscious we're only hearing half the story so far, but it clearly indicates that we seem to have a serious problem, in that I know Thomas said here that the policy is very clear from the Minister and what should happen, but the reality of what is happening is quite different. And there seems to be very little guidelines based on the contributions I've heard so far in relation to how schools are meant to act in relation to reduced timetables. We don't seem to know what the scale of the problem is, which is difficult to understand. And I am conscious maybe at this stage the fingers have been pointed at the schools, and I just wonder, and I'm conscious we haven't heard all the contributions. We need to hear their side of the story in relation to, do they have the infrastructure available to themselves and the machinery available to themselves to be able to deal with this situation properly? And that's where the department comes in again, to make sure that schools are properly resourced across all sectors to deal with situations like this. And I think that's important that we don't lose sight of that point either. But clearly from the contributions we've heard so far, there seems to be a serious problem in relation to this. There seems to be confusion as to when reduced hours are implemented, why are they being implemented, how long have they been implemented for, what happens when a child is on reduced hours, who is looking after that child, what are they meant to be doing. So there seems to be very little guidelines and very little direction from the contributions that we've heard so far, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the teachers and the schools' perspective as to what their opinion on that is, so that hopefully at the end of all this we can all put our heads together and get some clear direction as to how we can tackle this issue to the satisfaction of all concerned. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Gallagher. Well, just to add a few comments myself, and we've only reached the end of the first third, shall we say, of the hearing, so it is important not to jump to conclusions at this stage, but it is and has been unsettling to listen to the witnesses in terms of their experiences and the people that they represent. I think that, as Deputy Byrne said, the policy is clear, but in reality it's not happening like that. And the absence of guidelines from the department, and the absence of monitoring both by the department and TUSLA is concerning. And I think we have to accept the reality that reduced timetables are in place, and I know we'll have the opportunity to hear more from the boards of management from the teachers' perspective. But it's also concerning, apart from the educational development of young people, the social development is very important. So that holistic development of a child within a school with their peers. But we did also say, when we set the terms for reference for this, that we would be looking at the impact of reduced timetables, not just on students but on the whole school environment as well. And I think that's important to note. If I was to put a question to the witnesses, I think it would be around what other interventions you would like to see used, or you would suggest see used or utilised instead of a reduced timetable for schools, particularly with behaviour management issues. And also just in terms of the any empirical evidence that you have in terms of the anecdotal stories that you have put in front of us. So I'll go back to you. So if you want to indicate in what way you would like to answer, I take it whatever. Okay, Mark, you're first.
Sure. Just to be clear, there are guidelines. The National Education and Welfare Board published a book called Developing a Code of Discipline in Schools, and it's very, very clear. A child being denied any part of the school day, it's a suspension. Now, these are suspensions that go on for a period of time, and that same guideline will say rolling suspensions or inappropriate use of suspensions. So it's very, very clear. It's not been applied in that manner from the people, but the guideline that's there is quite clear. Deputy Byrne, before he went, he was saying, we'd often say the parents ignore the call. I know I had one parent that phoned me who ignored the call and were reported to TUSLA for not picking up the child because, it was deemed to be a welfare issue for the child. In relation to teaching, there's possibly a systemic issue there around the training. I know there was a recent survey by the Association of Secondary Teachers in Ireland, and they were saying that 5% of the respondents had a postgrad in special education, and 22% only had attended, and they used the word recent, they didn't say what recent was, sorry, in recent years had attended special ed CPD. So that's a bit of an issue. And, the Teaching Council is quite clear that a qualified teacher is qualified to teach all children and doesn't need any additional piece. I'm not aware of the inspector going in and asking those particular questions. Perhaps they do. I'm aware of one child that was on a reduced timetable where they were only in for 3 days a week, and it was because the school was only allocated an SNA for 3 days. A part access to an SNA. Child didn't have toileting issues, no behavioural issues. It was just purely down to resources. And by the time they'd come to us, they'd missed. They'd come to us in April, and they'd been on the reduced timetable since September. So significant period, and it just took a meeting with the school to say this isn't right, and it has to change, and it changed. There's no data, absolutely none. There's data collated on suspensions and expulsions, but none on, and as I said, the guidelines are very clear. These are suspensions, but there's no data collected, so we don't know the full extent of it. Only I suppose what we hear in our casework and the survey that we carried out. I think we had 101 respondents to a short survey we did for a different submission, all on short school days. Senator Ruane spoke about the benefit of inclusion, and the evidence base is very clear here. The best way to include a child is to have them in the school. It's to have them there, and to have them there as much as is possible. We even had a call this week of a parent there was a proposal for a shortened school day for the child. No striking out or so forth and so on. The child was becoming agitated and crying at a certain point in the day. He was in an autism class and he wasn't allowed to go out and play with his peers from the mainstream classes. He wanted to go out and mess with the big bunch. The parent said there was no physical issues that would prevent him from doing that. He quite liked the company of other children, but because he wasn't allowed out, he was getting quite, resort to crying and so forth, and that was the proposal for a short day there. Senator Gallagher, you were asking about what can be done for schools. For sure, in the vast majority of cases, vast majority of cases, schools are trying their best, and more than likely are coming to this as a last resort. But we've spoken about the outside stuff, the therapeutic supports, the mental health supports, and all of that. The reduced amount of NEPS assessments from memory are about 2 per 100 children. If you've got a third child that could benefit from that in a school, you're maybe in a bit of difficulty. But through our casework, we've also been made aware of families. Like one family spoke to me about the psychologist and speech and language therapist come in from St John of God's, did a full assessment and said, here's a behavioural plan that'll work really well for this young chap, but it wasn't implemented, and the short school day continued. And just in relation to your own comments, Deputy O'Loughlin, I suppose the alternatives, if it's, we've spoken about all the supports, and that would be really helpful for schools, and be really helpful for pupils. But it needs to be something that's not hidden. If you're going to suspend a child, do it in the official manner, and at least at that point, the pupil or the parent has got recourse through Section 29 of the Education Act. Collect the data on it so that we know how big the problem is. I've already said that perhaps something around the Epson Act is required. I know that the Association of Secondary Teachers were out as well, and they were very vocal and said, will you implement the Act, give us the training, give us the resources, etc. We're only too delighted to include. And empirical evidence, I'm only aware of an internal survey we did ourselves. I'm not aware of any robust research in the area in Ireland. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say, so thank you.
Thank you. Who else would like to come back? Lorraine.
Deputy Martin, you asked several questions, but some of them I think I might be able to answer for you. You asked about what do other countries do. So our nearest neighbour, the UK, as you know, their educational system is managed by borough as opposed to central government, and each of those boroughs would actually have a standard policy for reduced school days with a very basic step-by-step approach to how the decision is made, what factors would be taken into account, and then the process by which it is monitored. And it's essentially what we're looking for, in an Irish context. Interestingly enough, only several weeks ago, an ex-minister for education came over to Ireland from New Brunswick in Canada, and indeed he met with Minister McHugh at the behest of the NCSE. New Brunswick actually has a fully inclusive education system. They don't have special schools and special classes, but they still grapple with the issue of restricted school timetables. Which I found was very interesting. One of the reasons that they cite for this is the lack of actual investment in their inclusive special education system over the last couple of years when the ex-minister obviously wasn't in power. But it's very interesting that, a very different educational system, which is full inclusion, also has this issue, and they have wraparound supports in their school. But obviously, if there is a deficit, and we haven't heard from fellow witnesses from the school side, but I would, hazard a fairly concrete guess on the basis of anecdotal evidence that where there is lack of capacity in the schools with additional supports, that we'll probably see more use of reduced school timetables, particularly for schools where they are dealing with students that may exhibit challenging behaviour, whether due to socioeconomic circumstances or whether arising from their disability or whether arising from any other factor, as Senator Ruane indicated. Deputy O'Loughlin, you asked about what interventions can be used, and without reiterating the point, the lack of supports to schools that I'm sure our colleagues down there are going to start screaming about. So while indicating that the Minister has made a directive of sorts in parliamentary questions and schools just aren't listening, as Deputy Byrne indicated, I think that might be slightly unfair in schools who are constantly repeating, along with organisations representing people with disabilities, that a lack of the appropriate supports and investment into schools is causing an issue, and it's our children at the end of the day who are being impacted by it. I think Deputy Gallagher, you asked, or Senator Gallagher, sorry, you know, what's the scale? Well, we don't know, and that's what we do need to find out in order to address it. There was also a question in, what does the restricted school timetable look like? Well, there's a few things. Some we take no issue. So, for example, a child with additional needs going into junior infants, and for every child in most schools, they have a reduced timetable. They're in for short days for the first 2 weeks while they settle in. But for children with additional needs, they might be on even more restriction. It might be, you know, 10 minutes the first day, 20 minutes, half an hour, and build it up. We don't take an issue with that because it may actually be part of that child's transition plan into the mainstream or a new school setting. But how does it look like when a parent doesn't agree with it, where it's more punitive in nature, is the child doesn't come in the middle of the day. They usually come in at 9 o'clock and they're taken home at 9:30. Or they come in for whatever hours the school has dictated that they will be there, and they're taken home. So they don't come for segments of the school day by choice as to what subjects they might like. The other side of it, and again, we don't take issue with this, however, we'd like to see far more supports for these children, are children who are on reduced school timetables, but it's voluntary and it is due to major mental health issues such as anxiety. And in dealing with those children, yes, they do have a reduced timetable where they would select maybe one subject, maybe 1 day a week, or it might be 2 or 3 days a week, and they would come in just for that subject. And it is voluntary and it is planned and it is in the best interest of that child. However, my concern would be that for the rest of those days they don't have any other educational supports. And again, just referring to the home tuition scheme, we'd like to see something for those pupils, whether it is voluntary or involuntary, to fulfil what is a constitutional obligation by the state. So while we might argue whether we have, you know, concrete guidelines or not, there's still a constitutional obligation not to fail these children. In terms of, I think Deputy Martin, you asked about what are teachers' backgrounds and in terms of training, and I think we've repeatedly addressed the issue of core teacher training in relation to special educational needs. But restricted school timetables aren't, you know, something we just see in mainstream. We actually see them in special schools as well. So special schools would deem to be the most specialist of educational settings, whereby a child may start off in mainstream and end up in a special school. But where a child ends up in a restricted school timetable in a special school, and that's not successful and leads to suspension and possibly expulsion, then that child has nowhere else to go because they've already gone up that tree of speciality. And again, special schools would cite the lack of wraparound supports to those schools and being able to deal with the child and their difficulties, to be able to support them to reintegrate successfully back into the school. So, you know, again, we're repeating, I suppose, a lot of the same themes that go beyond restricted timetables, but they do play a very large part in this phenomenon that we still don't know, bar anecdotally, how big it really is.
Thank you, Lorraine. Maria.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that it's very clear, the right of every child to an education is clear in the Constitution. But what is also very clear is the state's failure to ensure that every traveller child has the right to equality of that education in terms of access to, participation in and outcomes from. There is a policy on suspensions, but reduced timetables are being used as another form of suspensions without calling it a suspension, as has already been said, in order to ensure they don't have to deal with the fallout from it. And that means then that there is that practice, that hidden practice of suspensions through reduced timetables, which is significantly impacting on particular groups of children within the education system. And one of those groups is traveller children. And where there are behavioural issues, that needs to be addressed. But let's be clear that it is not in all instances that there's behaviour of the child is an issue here. There is low expectations feeding into that, and some teachers have said that it is about low attainment levels and the child's struggle then to engage in the class. That should be further resourced, as I've said already, not suspension, not reduced timetables, which further reduces and puts back the child in relation to attainment levels. Where we're seeing this practice in primary school in particular, I want to say for the record, reduced timetables in any shape or form, except for clear medical reasons with clear guidance and protocols on a statutory basis, should not be happening. If there are issues, challenges, the school needs to be addressing those with the parents and whatever agencies and supports are there. That is not happening. So there is absolutely no rationale, as far as I'm concerned, for putting the majority of traveller children who are on reduced timetables. That should not be happening. And we are hearing very clearly that it is the first port of call that some schools, I'm not saying all, but some schools are coming to with regard to traveller children. I mean, one of the case studies we gave in our submission was around a young traveller girl in 6th year who was, she was effectively the last man standing in terms of her cohort of 4 or 5 friends and relations who were traveller children had dropped out at that stage. A request was made of the school to let her sit in on the 3rd year canteen, where there was a cousin and 3 other traveller girls who were doing their junior cert. That was refused. And in the discussion then, the follow-up discussion with the mother and principal, the only alternative that was on the table was putting her on a reduced timetable, which the mother had said clearly was not an option. She wanted to get her child to Leaving Cert, and the best opportunity and outcome of that was being in the classroom for the full day. And subsequent to that, the 4 traveller children that were in the junior cert year in that canteen that she'd been asking for her daughter to sit in with, were put on reduced timetables, where behavioural issues weren't an issue. In that same location, because there's one school that is putting excessive numbers of traveller children on reduced timetables, traveller children in other schools are looking to be transferred to it in order to get the shorter timetable, which is also a product of the lack of expectations from the education system with regard to traveller children. In terms of some of the questions that have been asked in terms of the lack of data and numbers and how schools reach that decision, I suppose in some ways, as has already been said, we're equally at a loss to that, because the schools are saying that there isn't data being collected. We've been told that the inspector doesn't ask that question, in terms of reduced timetables. So, and if the minister is clearly stating at national level this practice is unacceptable, and schools are practising it with particular groups of children to excess and without just cause, or going to that as the solution rather than working the rest of it out, then that actually is incredibly unacceptable, and it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be stamped out seriously, and schools need to be held to account where it isn't being addressed. In terms of traveller children being put on the reduced timetables, and as I said earlier, in terms of the primary school element of it, I mean, those children are going to be lost to the system in terms of, trying to then engage in a secondary school system where there's a history of educational disadvantage and marginalisation and discrimination and racism. It had literally been stamped that those children will not get to junior cert or will not get to Leaving Cert. And we see that with the statistics that are borne out right across the board. So it does need to be seriously addressed. Section 29 as a procedure around suspensions is there, absolutely. But it puts the onus back on parents it puts the onus back on parents. The onus should not be on parents. Schools should be held to account with regard to this. And the one thing I will say is that it will be really important in terms of assessing the scale of where we're at with regard to the reduced timetables, that an independent investigation is undertaken by the Ombudsman for Children that looks at what are the numbers, the scale of it, the reasons for, and the consequences for the children that are put on those reduced timetables. Yes, resources are needed. I mean, there's been, and I'm going to finish with this point, there's been wide-scale cuts in terms of resources, particularly around traveller education, and we've seen the consequences of that, as you've heard in the earlier sitting in March, and we currently have only, anecdotally, albeit, 80% of a transfer rate of traveller children from primary to secondary. That's unacceptable and needs to be addressed. But resources also need to be given to support the families as well, and to support local traveller organisations in trying to, stamp this out while engaging with schools to do this as well.
Okay, thanks, Maria. I would point out that parents are the primary educator of the children, and we won't achieve anything without parents working with schools. It takes a village to rear a child, so I think everybody coming together to try to solve the challenges that are there.
Absolutely, and parents are engaging with the schools.
Absolutely. I'm going to let Patrick in now.
Thank you. I'll do my best not to repeat what's already been said, but I'll take a couple of the points you made, and I'll start with yourself in regards to you were saying about confusion in regards to how and who does the reduced timetables. Like, if you look at the confusion, it's already adding to the parents and the child's stress because there's not a clear rationale for its use. Just in regards to Senator Ruane, you spoke about data. To my knowledge, and I'd like to hear from others, to my knowledge, data is collected in primary school and also published, but not secondary school. So it makes sense for it to be collected and published in secondary school when it's happening in primary. And just in regards to Catherine, you spoke about why and who decides what subjects the children will go on. I think it's important also to know who also makes that decision as well as the why. So there are a couple of points I just wanted to put across without repeating everything else. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. And thank you for your brevity. We're now going to move to the second part of the engagement. And again, I'd like to welcome our 4 stakeholders, our 4 witnesses that are here. So, Kieran Golden, who is President of the NAPD. Kieran, could I ask you, please, to make your presentation? Thank you.
Good morning, Chairperson, Deputies and Senators and fellow invitees. The NAPD is very grateful for the opportunity to make a submission to the Committee for Education and Skills on the use of reduced timetables in schools. Members of our executive were invited to forward comments on areas that they regarded as relevant to this particular submission. I'm also speaking in my own capacity as a principal of a community school. I was in school yesterday and I'll be in school first thing in the morning. School timetables, first and foremost, are all about ensuring that our students access the curriculum as prescribed by the Department of Education and Skills. The primary goal of our timetables are to meet the needs of all our students, and I'm stressing all our students. Effective timetabling is all about supporting all our students to reach their full potential. Effective timetabling and clever timetabling and strategic timetabling can facilitate our students to access the additional resources that are provided to us by the Department through the allocations model. And in many schools, they've got very effective and creative use of team teaching, which can meet the needs of all the students in the classroom. Again, effective timetabling can also be used to reduce and to minimise possible disciplinary challenges as well. However, in exceptional circumstances, and I'm stressing exceptional circumstances, consideration may have to be given to reduced timetables to help with a variety of challenges. For example, medical issues, if you have a student and we meet them who are dealing with very serious, significant medical issues, a student who is reintegrating, coming back to us after a long period of absence. I've sat opposite students who've had, serious issues around mental health, and to ask that student to come into school for a full day would have been very difficult for them. And you do everything you can to help the student and their parents to get that student back into school in a meaningful way. And there are times as well where behavioural issues are so significant that it's not just impacting on the rights of the child, but on the rights of the other students in that classroom as well. Reduced timetables should only be considered and agreed in consultation between school management, the students themselves, the parents and the guardians, and very much in consultation with external agencies. And I'll be specific when I'm talking about the external agencies who advocate for the students. We're talking about your Education Welfare Officer with TUSLA, NEPS, or SENO with the NCSE. If you're fortunate enough to be one of the 75 schools involved with the MBSS, with the Behaviour for Learning teachers, a wonderful resource for schools really, and if you're fortunate enough to access the services of CAMS. While there are times that a reduced timetable may be used, the goal of the timetable should always be about the child and getting them back into school. In terms of managing it, and offering the idea of a reduced timetable, it's on a continuum. It's the last option, where everything else has been considered, where all other resources have been used. It's very much at the end of a continuum. And I have to say, I fully agree with Patrick. There needs to be real conditions and parameters around the use of a timetable. And I'll be specific. There's a start date, there's an end date, there's reviewing on a daily basis through the use of things like report cards, there's regular meeting with the parents, and then you're deciding what's best for the individual child and where we're going with this. So there's a start date and there's an expiry date as well. And it's very much at the end of a continuum. I'm very conscious as a school principal that the impact of disengagement from school is catastrophic for our young people. It is absolutely catastrophic. And once a child is marginalised, it has significant impacts, not just on their individual well-being, but on their life chances. Not just for that child, but very often for their whole family as well. So the idea of reducing a timetable should only be used in very exceptional circumstances, in the best interests of the child, and clearly indicating a plan that will indicate a transition for that young person back into school, or where appropriate, a lateral movement to another placement that will serve the very real specific needs of that individual child. Again, I'll pause and I thank you for the opportunity, and I'll answer any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kieran. And now I'm going to ask Pat Goff, who's the CEO of the IPPN. Thank you.
Okay, look, Deputy Senators, on behalf of IPPN, I welcome the opportunity to talk about the issues about the reduced timetable, and I would also say that I speak as a principal who operated reduced timetables. So I will hold up my hand and say that as a principal, that's what I operated as well. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Kieran has said, because actually a lot of them, he could have been looking at my script as well in terms of IPPN are actually in favour of reduced timetables, but only in very limited circumstances. And be that medical or be it as part of an overall plan for that particular pupil. If it is of benefit to the pupil, and the pupil has to be at the centre of it. And I know points were raised earlier about parental consent. Every teacher and principal I know would say straight out that where the home and the school are working together, there are better outcomes. And so if there's not agreement there, then this cannot happen. The second point I would make is that in relation to the Constitution, and why are principals and schools operating a system that in theory is against the Constitution? Because by and large, principals are fairly law-abiding in how they go about their work. But they are faced with the dilemma on a daily basis, and this is part of the problem that we have. And the dilemma is balancing the rights of that individual pupil and the rights of the other pupils in the class as well. And that's one of the constants that we would have. Some children do not operate well in a system, and that is just a fact of life for those particular pupils. And yet we insist on shoehorning them into the system that we have in schools, simply because that's the system that we're operating. In terms of supports, and it was mentioned earlier, As a school principal, you cannot wait 2 years to get therapeutic supports, and that's part of the problem we have. Sometimes we have SNAs that will support those pupils, but the SNA may not be the right person. We don't have the behaviour backup. Now, there is a new model being proposed by the NCSE, and we look forward to that, where there are going to be regional support teams. That might help, but it's not going to be the be-all and end-all. So, from an IPPN point of view on primary school principals, the reduced timetable has to be for a very specific purpose, very specific time frame. The other issue that was raised there, that it's silent suspension. In my own time in school, and 32 years as a school leader, it would actually been easier at times for me to suspend a pupil than to do a reduced timetable. So it's not as if it's either or, in the sense of that putting a child on a reduced timetable was an easy way out. In fact, sometimes it was a harder way out, in that the suspension, because you followed your guidelines, and I know the NEWB guidelines were mentioned there. Every school principal, they're like a Bible to them if they have to deal with these issues. So it's not an either-or situation, and I think where most school principals were coming from is if they could avoid suspension, they would at all costs, you know, in terms of from the good of the pupil and the self-esteem of the pupil. And those would be some of the issues that would be there. In terms of being no official recognition of the extent of the problem, that's because there's nobody asking. Like, POD is there in primary schools, the primary online database. Very easy to create an extra field and put this into it. We do returns to TUSL every year. Very easy to create an extra field if we wanted. And I'm not sure whether the department want to actually get the figures in relation to this. And this is the dilemma that schools are faced with and that principals are faced with. So I'll leave it at that, Claire, for the moment, but I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. And now I go to Hildegarde.
I suppose I'll probably be repeating some of what others have said, but I'm speaking from boards of management point of view, and I'm not going to introduce myself because I know the members know me here before.
So more than anybody.
I think I'm nearly a frequent flyer. We get air miles here.
we'll nearly give you a pass.
Yeah, good. I suppose what I had said in my submission is that you must couch all of this in the two things. One is the code of behaviour, which Pat and others mentioned, and those guidelines recognise that each school has its own unique characteristics. So special education and special schools would look at those in that fashion. It isn't the first port of call. And of course the second thing that we must look at is the Education Act and the EPSIN Act, and as Pat said, the rights of the other children to be educated. So I suppose there's no provision in law or the Department of Education or Skills Circular for the use of the reduced timetable or the reduced day, and we actually got some legal advice on that way back. And I suppose, but for some pupils, the school day is actually too long. Like Pat said, it could be, this shortened school day could be for medical, communications or behavioural difficulties, and it may need to be reduced temporarily. I mean, if somebody rings me and they say, I'm faced with this, I will actually ask them what else did they try, and they've tried everything else, like Pat has said, and actually do not want to suspend the child. They want to keep them in school for some part of it. And there's also health and safety concerns, which we're going to talk about, but people want to have a kind of a positive school experience. Sometimes then students need a one-to-one support, and someone alluded to that earlier, and they may not be within the resources of the school to provide that one-to-one support. And of course the last thing that they might use a shortened school day would be for medical reasons, and no access to a school nurse, I suppose, is very important. But the decision, and this is the important one, the decision to use this shortened school day should be focused on the well-being of the student concerned, should be discussed and agreed in advance with the parents and the multidisciplinary team if you have one, should see a decrease, should see a decrease in the occurrences of undesirable behaviour if that's why, and if it doesn't, then you need to look at other options. Should only be used in exceptional circumstances, and that's absolutely positively there, and include a timeline and plan for increasing the time in the school and for the the pupil to eventually attend for the full school day and should be constantly monitored and reviewed. And this is coming from our own group of principals and that. And I've always advised that the reduced school day should only be for a small period of time, and everything else should be tried and documented. And it's sometimes the reduced school day for pupils with special education needs is the only option they have to actually get their constitutional rights. So some suggested solutions, I always come with a few solutions, and I think the same ones have probably been repeated a few years in advance. But I go back again to whole school training in the areas of positive behaviour support, and that should be for all school staff, including bus escorts. And I've always said that. And there should be maybe an annual training fund for schools so that they can access that, because that is a very, very expensive form of training, and that's quite hard to get. And I note that the new school inclusion model, which is in some of our own area, Deputy O'Loughlin, includes a new national training system for SNAs, which I welcome, because we've been looking for that for a long time. I'm looking, and I'm also recommending that we finally implement as absolute policy the recommendation of the NCSE policy advice, where there's a reduced pupil-teacher ratio for children with special serious medical needs. Another issue that arises is the substitute cover for special education. The first day of absence is never covered, and it's very difficult for schools to break up a school, class of children with special education needs. And I've also mentioned the area of posts of responsibility, where we welcome the appointment of admin deputy principals for schools with 15 class teachers, but we do think an examination of the needs of these schools should allow consideration for further school management supports. And I've also mentioned in my submission this new school inclusion model again, and they talk about a new national nursing support and increased access to NEPs. And at long last, the Department, after some years of ourselves, NAMSI and other education partners looking for the guidelines on behaviour, challenging behaviour, there is a group, an expert group in existence who are working on those and who should be publishing those for the next school year. So I think that's really important. And last but not least is some school buildings are actually unsuitable for purpose, special schools especially, and you've seen them yourself, anybody here, and they're catering for pupils between 4 and 18, so the child at 4 is completely different to the needs at 18. So I think these factors should be looking at, when people are looking at applications to improve their school buildings, I think that should be taken into consideration. And the last thing I'm going to say is, I was actually at a launch of I was at a garden party last night in the Phoenix Park School, and that school did a nurture garden, a sanctuary nurture garden, and they said to me, and it's a school for children with severe emotional behavioural difficulties, and they said the difference that garden has made, and they did not get any funding for that from anyone. It was sponsored, it was from other sources and fundraising. So that's serious concern as well. We do need other things other than teachers and SNAs.
Thank you, Breda. And now I'm going to ask finally Michael to speak. Dr. Michael Redmond, who's Director of Research and Development at the Joint Managerial Body Secretariat of Secondary Schools.
Thank you, Chair and members. The conversation so far is quite rightly focused on the needs of vulnerable individuals within our systems. The schools in our state are probably the most complex and structured and heavily regulated institutions in the country. And within that then, a secondary school timetable has to attempt to answer the questions: who teaches what, to whom, where and when, for hundreds of students at any given time. So school timetables end up like a locked-in jigsaw, and secondary schools have limited flexibility to design a bespoke timetable for any particular student who needs, for example, a range of so-called practical subjects, but where these happen to run concurrently. Now, we need, I think, to distinguish between a reduced curriculum and a reduced timetable or a school day, as they're not always the same thing. A student can be studying a reduced number of subjects but still have other learning opportunities that provide for a full day every day, and the new junior cycle framework allows for this. Schools, as other colleagues have said, do not take the decision to reduce a student's timetable lightly. and they don't take it unilaterally either. These decisions are usually taken in context, or are, in my experience, are always taken in consultation with parents or guardians and the professional services where schools can get them. For every student who has a reduced timetable developed for them, there can be a long backstory of efforts, interventions, creative solution seeking, professional engagement and encouragement provided by their school. This approach is almost, as you've heard, always a last resort. The consequences of reducing the school day can be to reduce the breadth of the curriculum and interrupt continuity of tuition in some subjects. And so decisions to reduce a timetable are often taken as a trade-off. It can be unrealistic and unfair to force an adolescent into the straitjacket of a full-on timetable and a socially intensive school day when she or he is clearly not able for it for a period of time. A concern, however, arises where a reduced timetable may be put in place instead of a more effective strategy. So why would a school contemplate this, even with the agreement of parents? And the answer lies in the failure of the state, as has been said many times this morning, to provide a wraparound, professionalised therapeutic, psychiatric and behavioural therapy service to schools and students. It's virtually impossible to get timely and recurring access to an occupational or speech and language therapist or a specialist in emotional behaviour support. School principals find themselves landed in the roles of counsellor, psychotherapist, behaviour management specialist, family mediator and decision maker well beyond the fields of their expertise or qualification. And as has been said, the promised NCSE framework for supporting students with additional care needs is being trialled, but it cannot come soon enough. And meanwhile, many principals have a sense of being abandoned to care for students in crisis and still ensure that the educational experience and outcomes of the majority in our overcrowded classrooms are protected. So there now exists an opportunity to properly resource the NCSE strategy for supporting students, which will eliminate in most cases the need to reduce a student's school day. Thank you, Chair, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Michael. And now I'm going to go to the members. Deputy Martin.
Thank you. Thank you for presentations. I suppose the questions I have are nearly like a follow-up to the questions I've asked earlier and developing that again. And firstly, I do recognise the fact that a lot of this is to do with the fact that schools are under-resourced, that the proper supports to ensure our children have the education they deserve and that well-rounded education they deserve, and the supports that are identified are not in place, and that's due to lack of investment. But in relation to accessing the curriculum and that right to access the curriculum, just I suppose developing, as Patrick said, who is deciding what subjects the child gets access to, and due to what criteria? Like, are you entitled to learn English and Irish, but you're not entitled to learn this, especially at second level in that broader curriculum, because in primary school all your teachers will have that same training, but it differs in secondary school. Training in relation to subject-related training. Are parents given any information once it is decided that, or the decision, or it's agreed, if it is agreed, that their child is on a reduced timetable? What sort of reporting is given? You know, that these are the teachers that you're having with your child. These are the subjects they learned. This is how they're progressing. What happens if a parent disagrees and does not want their child on a reduced timetable? Do we know, just because you've experienced as principals, I suppose, Pat and Karen, what happens if a parent says, I do not want my child on a reduced timetable whatsoever, I want full, what happens there for the parent and for the principal? Clearly indicating the plan for transition back to full-time, is that given to the parent, a plan? This is how this is going to work, and this is our roadmap to get your child back into a full timetable. Does the department write to you as principals and ask, do you operate a reduced timetable? How many students are on that timetable? How is the decision made? Did the parents agree? What supports do you need to help you, get that child back to, that sort of assessment, the supports or how it operates. I'm just thinking, if my son or daughter is put on a reduced timetable and I'm in full-time work, I can't pick them up from school. So are they sitting in the office, and are they sitting there with the secretary waiting to be picked up? There's a whole that's again is segregation, because the rest of the schools see that child sitting in the office. It can't be good for the office staff either if there's behavioural difficulties and you're just waiting there for 2 or 3 hours. The best behaved students would misbehave if they're left for 2 hours in an office. But I'm just wondering what happens in that scenario when you ring and say we want. I can't believe you would ring at 9:30 or 9:10 and say it's time for your child to go home. That's just beyond. But there's a lot there. Sorry, but if you can answer, maybe delighted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Chair. And can I apologise first of all to the first group that I was at the Business Committee and trying to multitask. So my apologies, but I've read your submissions and was here for your answers. I suppose the first thing, I think this is really important, because this is something that's been hidden, and we're shedding light on a subject that most educational issues, people know a lot about them, but very few people, I think, know about this issue of reduced timetables. So I suppose my first question is really, would all of you support returning data to the Department of Education? I think it was Pat that said that it would be easy enough to put an extra field on the pod. So if this was a recommendation, would you support it? Because it would seem to me that that is one of the most important steps, is that the department actually knows the extent of it. So my first question. My second question is, I think, Kieran, you said that you felt that it should be done by agreement with parents. So again, if you can all maybe answer me, is it always done by agreement with parents? Are there discussions with parents? Or is it just the phone call that Catherine has just referred to? Because I think, as Lorraine said responding in the first session, sometimes parents understand and agree that a reduced timetable is appropriate for a child where they might have particular health issues or issues that the parent recognises that staying at school all day is a difficulty for them. But do you agree that it should be done in consultation with parents at all times? Then I suppose the other question is around when a child is not given their constitutional right to be in school for their education, their right then to have an alternative when they're outside the school. Maybe this isn't so much a question for yourselves as a question for the Department of Education, but it would seem to me an absolute corollary that if you're not getting your educational support in school, you should be getting it somewhere else. So again, maybe that's more appropriate to the Department of Education. But and I suppose my final question then is around, there seems to be a general agreement that this should only be a last resort, that it should be in consultation, it shouldn't happen, it should be rare, and it should be a final kind of resort where other interventions have happened. But yet the reality from the first group of speakers seems to be that it is fairly widespread. So while there may be an ideal of how it should operate in schools, it seems that there are schools where that isn't the case, and that children are regularly put on reduced timetables. So what I'd like to see is that we would have very clear information around when and how it happens, who is consulted, that the Department of Education knows, and that it's not something that's somewhere in the murky, hidden activities that the child is unfortunately, at the end of it all. But that it's very clear, it's very public. We know why it happens, when it happens, and that there's alternative support for the child. So I suppose I'm putting those very general questions, but probably my first couple of questions are more specific to yourselves in relation to the first couple of ones I asked about sharing data and that it should be by agreement.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy. Senator Gallagher.
Yeah, just to avoid repetition, based on your contributions, I'm heartened by what you've outlined as procedure within your schools, and I take Kieran and Pat's points and their experience of being school principals over a long period of time. It would, from the face of it, seem to be a slight conflict, might be too strong of a word to use, but in your contributions and the contributions that we heard, first of all, this morning, in that in relation to when reduced timetables are implemented, it's done, and I'm heartened by the fact that total last resort, and I accept that, and by agreement by the parents. Based on the contributions this morning, it would appear from the first presentations that maybe that's not always the case, and maybe we'll look forward for a bit of interaction in that regard. I said in my earlier contribution that the finger, if you like, is being pointed in the school's direction. I think that's unfair, in my opinion. What clearly we've learned from this morning is that the school don't have the necessary machinery or infrastructure to be able to do this job properly in that regard. I think the system is failing not just the parents and the children involved, it's also failing the schools and the teachers and the principals within the schools. And the fact that the department, if you like, is turning your back on the whole issue, it would appear, in that they don't seem to want to know what the scale of the problem is, never mind trying to address the problem, and that's very, very worrying. And I think, as a result of what we've heard this morning, the finger, in my opinion, has been clearly pointed in the right direction, and that's back to the department. They have it within their gift to find a solution to what we all are looking for this morning, and the fact that a simple thing like a pod, as Pat outlined, where you could do a return every so often in relation to the scale of the problem and how it's been addressed, would be a natural first step, in my opinion. And clearly that's something that I'm sure we, as a committee, we take on board, and it'll be one of our recommendations. You also spoke this morning of, and I think the first time I heard it, was the impact on the child of reduced timetables. I think that's a key issue. Children nowadays are under more pressure than at any time before, and I think the fact of being segregated in any regard would have a serious impact on that child's well-being going forward. That's something we have to be very, very conscious of. But I'm heartened by the fact that it is the last resort, and that, by and large, that is done in consultation with the parents for the benefit of that child. But I would like to thank you for your contributions of both this morning, and I can speak for I'm a lot wiser than I was before it started, and I thank you for that. And as I say, it's an issue that we'll have to follow up with the department sooner rather than later to try and get some direction as to how we go about trying to, first of all, find the extent of the problem and then implement measures to try and address the problem. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Senator Gallagher. Senator Ruane.
Thank you. I think Deputy O'Sullivan kind of hit a lot of my points is around that there doesn't seem to be any disagreement around how the collection of data in relation to this, and then it's about how we actually do it, because I think what's the problem is actually as well, we don't have a clear pattern of why it's being used, and we don't have that because we can't record it. So if all these interventions have happened before the point of last resort, what are those interventions? What did they look like for that child, that family? Are they relative to that individual child, or are they, blanket approaches? And the fact that we're missing all this information and knowledge of everything that's been put in place until that point, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice, because if we look at other schools, maybe they've been implementing different types of interventions that have been working, and without the ability to collect that information from schools, we're not going to be able to look at other practices or look at other schools that are actually not using reduced timetables and what are they actually doing. So we need to be able to collect data from all schools, I suppose, on how they manage the different situations. And I think something is much more clear cut, not that a child should be ever, missing out on school, but when it comes to, say, disability or special ed, we can sometimes point further along the line to medical reasons, different interventions from CNO, whether that, I know there's been a huge amount of parents have said they've had no interaction with their CNO when they actually should have. So where is that information? What kind of work is the CNO doing in relation to collecting that information in terms of the families that they support and stuff? So that's another piece I think that we need to look at. But something I still don't understand, when we step away from the special ed system and we can clearly point at different factors, I'm still kind of at a loss when we look at say, traveller children or children from socio-economic backgrounds that don't have any historical data on them in relation to special educational needs or any other supports, you know, in the long term within their history or within their school, and it is purely, I'm not sure what it is, you know. So if we were to collect the data on traveller children, I wonder what that would look like, because they're a particular cohort where special needs kind of cuts across every single school, where travellers that's a particular cohort, and I wonder what are the reasons given. I mean, I know there's two situations whereby I know one kid in Tala was given an iPad when he went into school every morning and just sat in the classroom with the iPad, you know, where there was it was the low expectation stuff actually, does a real kind of acceptance that this child might not continue, maybe because their siblings hadn't, or whatever kind of view that they had, and that was the child set with the iPad every day, and that was at primary level. Another young girl at secondary level, heading towards her junior cert, reported that the teacher's not really investing in her in terms of preparation for her junior cert, because she was going to be getting married when she turned 16, and that was all. So they showed no interest, because they were somehow assuming that one negated the other, instead of accepting that this was the young girl's situation, but also that she did want to do her junior cert and continue with her education. So I'm just wondering, there's a couple of different cohorts about how do we resource special ed in a way that there's no reduced timetables, and that buildings are adequate, and that special needs assistance and everything else that's needed. But what about those other cohorts where we don't actually have even a medical background or some sort of socio kind of analysis of why the reduced timetables are being used? And I think that being able to collect data on all instances across all schools on why the reduced timetables are being used, and then teachers having to be accountable in some sense, and everyone involved, because they would have to show what they've put in place, and then we can see what's working and what's not working. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think, I wouldn't jump to the assumption that teachers haven't tried other methods, but have they tried them in isolation, like before they actually, you know, worked with the wider services or the teachers, so that everybody's on board? Because I know, as I couldn't be here this morning, but in their research, like, some of their parents were saying that they didn't have any interaction with the school in terms of giving consent or up until that point, and actually the reduced timetable was as a result of the beginning of disciplinary procedures, and it turned into a reduced timetable. So discipline, I think, and looking at the factors why somebody might medically or for other emotional or whatever reasons be reduced. But if we're looking at a disciplinary thing, well, then that needs to be looked at, because that ties into the code of behaviour stuff, but also how we manage difficult behaviour, especially in schools that are in communities that are experiencing huge amount of trauma before they even enter the classroom. So it's like, if you have a whole school that is experiencing a collective kind of trauma of what goes on in their community in a daily life, we need to actually be able to adapt their training and our teachers to understand that teaching can look a little different in those communities actually, and you know, a reduced timetable not necessarily, because I can tell you, as someone who left school very young, my reduced timetable, it might have been, you know, forced upon myself, but I was at home doing drugs instead. That was not for the better of me. They might have sat down and said, actually, she's really stressed and frustrated in school, but the other half of the day I was at home stoned. So that's actually not. So when we're saying the best for the student, are we taking in best for the student in the long term, or best for the student when they re-enter the community, or best for the student? So it's like, you know, how do we actually apply that? And because it might seem like the best for the student in that situation because they're frustrated in school, actually the other alternative might not look too good either. And how do we actually measure that? And I think just to finish, I think it's very clear that most people agree that to be able to give the full picture, we need to actually be able to give the mechanisms to schools to actually show what is being done, what's not being done, and why, and the outcomes. So for them children that actually have re-entered school, and it has been, like, what are the steps and what are the outcomes and what are the follow-ups? And I think we definitely need to move quite rapidly towards actually having that type of knowledge, because it's only then you will see the patterns and the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Byrne, do you wish to make a comment? Okay, that's fine. I'll just make a very brief comment myself. First of all, can I just say I completely accept the bona fides of everybody that's been here in terms of what you have brought to the discussion. I think it's been really, really important. And, you know, just listening to the four of you, I do accept that in some instances where you have outlined that a reduced timetable is actually better than expulsion or suspension, that if it is the best way to keep a student within the school system, then that has to be better than not having them within the system at all, and obviously then with some illnesses, that is important. I think the point is very well made, and my colleagues have been talking about it in terms of data collection, and totally agree with that. That's really important to quantify the situation, to get the extra supports that are absolutely needed from the department, because it is very difficult for teachers within a class and within a school setting if there are really extreme behavioural issues. And we do have to look at that and the impact of the other children within a class. But we absolutely cannot ignore it. It's an issue for everybody. It's an issue for the whole school community, for the family and for the community at large. And most definitely those extra supports that are needed absolutely should be provided. In terms of the children that are on reduced timetables, and if it is for a period of time, albeit it should never be for a prolonged period of time, the fact that there is no access to home tuition when a student is on a reduced timetable is very regrettable. And I think that's absolutely something that needs, so I'd just like to know your views in relation to that. I think, Breda, you were talking about the extra resources and training for the school. I think that's absolutely hugely important, because in a lot of cases, teachers and the school staff are absolutely not equipped to deal with some of the situations, and possibly if more investment was put in to training at that point, it would be a better outcome for all of us. And we have to bear in mind also, I know Deputy Martin raised the point about parents that are working, and then all of a sudden they have a situation where they have to take their child from school. And for a lot of parents, they may choose to stay at home while their children are young, with the view that when their children are going to school that they can get back into the workforce. And that's a reasonable expectation. But all of a sudden, if you're in this situation, it's very difficult. And also for children who travel by bus to school, because if they have a reduced timetable, there may be a situation where there is no car at home, either because there isn't a car or because a parent has gone to work in the car. And it's extremely difficult for parents, the other parent then, to be able to manage to collect the child. So all of these issues have to be brought to bear. And just, I suppose, one last question. I think it's clear we're hearing maybe conflicting things about guidelines that are there and whether we need more robust guidelines in relation to it. But I think, and also whether there is collaboration between parents and teachers, or whether the school makes the decision. And in all cases, it should be a collaboration. But there also should be an appeals mechanism for parents. And I think that, if we have a situation where there is one single entity collecting the information and giving the guidelines, and more than likely that's the Department of Education, there should be a clear appeals mechanism for the parents to be able to go to on that. So I'll go back to the four of you now. So, okay, Pat, you want to answer first?
Just in relation to a number of points that were raised there, Deputy O'Sullivan, would we support returning statistics 100%? As schools and school principals, we feel we've nothing to hide. We would rather be transparent and open about everything that we do. So 100% we would support that. Deputy Martin and also Deputy Sullivan raised, is it always in agreement with parents? I would be very surprised if a child is put on a reduced day and that's the first meeting that the principal and the teacher has had with that parent, because normally we would have been working through an IEP, an individual education plan for that particular child, and as would be pointed out earlier, if this wasn't the last resort, then it shouldn't be used at that stage. So I would say that there would have been a lot of meetings prior to a meeting to discuss reduced timetables. So the question then would arise is if there's still conflict or whether a parent doesn't agree with it. And unfortunately, in those cases, what would happen sometimes then is the only alternative for the school is a suspension in that case. And that's possibly what would have happened if there wasn't a reduced timetable in that case. In terms of homeschooling, 100% I would agree, but I think that also needs to be monitored. We would not like to see homeschooling take the place of school, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it should be more easily accessible, 100% in relation to that. In terms of also the where the child is left, if I ring you and you either refuse to come or you can't come, in primary schools, 60% of our principals are teaching principals, so they don't have a choice in terms of they have to teach a class anyway. They have limited secretarial support, so in terms of where you'd leave the child or what the case would be, the child would obviously have to continue either in class, or if that was no longer, would maybe move to another class, whatever the case would be. That's primary school. The decision on the reduced timetable as regards subjects and that, a lot would depend on what the purpose of the reduced timetable was for. If it was, sometimes if the yard and the breaks, whether they were out there at that time, that sometimes is the trigger with some pupils, or would be the trigger. And then would you be looking at that as part of their behaviour plan, or whatever the case would be, that if that trigger was taken out of the equation, then maybe the afternoon would be different. So those would be the different issues we'll be dealing with. So it's always a constant dilemma, and that's the issue that we would face.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Kieran.
Thanks very much. I've had the privilege of being involved in senior management for the last 10 years, and I would say that in the last 5 years in particular, which is a good thing, we are more and more accountable. Principals are accountable, schools are accountable, and parents shouldn't be under the illusion that, well, he made the decision and that's it, or she made the decision. You're accountable. You're accountable to your board of management. I'm answerable to the board of management in our school. And it's the old Donald Rumsfeld phrase, compliance, compliance, compliance. Schools now are very compliant places. So parents are perfectly entitled to ask the question, I'll appeal that, I can appeal that. Can you give me more details on that? And some of the points are well made by my colleagues here around that. We are accountable for what we do. Thankfully, we don't have to make decisions in isolation. And that protects all of us. It's interesting, maybe if I kind of bring some of the questions together, if that's okay, rather than me trying to remember who asked which.
No, absolutely.
If that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of accountability again, another form of accountability for schools are the inspectorate. As a principal, this year alone, we've had a WSE MLL recently, we had a DESH evaluation, you have incidental inspections, you have SEN evaluations, and timetables are checked. Now the question is, they're school timetables, not individual timetables, okay? But every child is entitled to 28 hours tuition at second level. And you will be asked, they will go through, the inspector will go through the timetable methodically, and they will check that the students are getting 28 hours tuition. It was very interesting recently, actually. I've had WSE MLLs and incidentals and subject inspections. We had a DESH evaluation recently in schools. And one of the questions there actually is very, very forensic. They look for very specific data. People are talking about data. The questions in the DESH evaluation at post-primary, I'm not sure about primary, but the questions in the post-primary evaluations are, how many suspensions have you had in the last 4 years, male, female? How many expulsions have you had in the last 4 years, male, female? How many of your students are on reduced timetables, male, female? Now, I was able, in my own context, to say we had 0 in the last 4 years. And anecdotally, I'll tell you why. About 6 years ago, I had a particular student who was going into senior cycle. He was extremely challenging. And Senator Ruane, I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of communities. Our school is a sanctuary, it's a safe place for our kids. It's an important place for them. This particular boy, because of a variable of reasons, was extremely difficult. We had went through all the options. What kind of supports had been offered to him? He'd been referred to student support team, he'd worked with guidance counsellor, he'd worked with the learning support teacher, he'd worked with the education welfare officer, we'd worked with the parents on numerous occasions. He had that one significant adult, which we all know about. We had teachers trained up in Check and Connect, so they met with that student, but we were coming towards a point where it was getting extremely difficult for the better of, for other kids as well. And we tried, the EWO actually persuaded us to try a reduced timetable. It was an absolute disaster. And I'll tell you why it was a disaster. That student ended up being totally disengaged, disinfected from school, and that was almost his pathway out of school. We were almost formalising. Do you know what now? Your behaviour is so difficult, it's so difficult, we have to formalise that. 4 weeks later, another student comes into the office and he says, "Sir, I'll have the timetable that he's had for the last few weeks. Can I try that?" So it's not necessarily the right way. And what are the behaviours of students telling us? We have to ask them, what are they telling us? What are the behaviours of students telling us in our schools, and hear what they have to say? In terms of like a reduced timetable at post-primary level, and I hear what you say in terms of, you know, having a conversation with the student, saying, okay, what teachers do you get on well with? I couldn't see it working, because you've got 9 periods in a school day, so they tell you, well, I like Miss Ruane, she's sound, I don't like Miss Martin, and I like Miss O'Sullivan. But you're with you period 1, they won't go to your class period 2, and they go to your class period 3. Where do they go period 2? Because the issue for us is, I go back to my issue around compliance, is safeguarding. Who's going to mind that child for the 40 minutes? We have a duty of care. Am I going to ring Mom? Can you come for 40 minutes? They say, are you serious? So it's this issue around compliance and minding the kids, and it's just not workable in terms of having a kid in for one class and out for another class. And then, of course, okay, the other issues, where do you get the teacher? All your teachers are timetabled. All your teachers, we're doing a timetable presently, our timetable is going to be in the month of June. You can't free somebody up to mind somebody, and they deserve to be minded. And I suppose my final point as well is just in terms of home tuition. Again, where does that parent get the right person to do it? Where does that parent get the right teacher to mind their children and to mind their child and give them good quality learning and teaching at home or wherever it might take place for that particular child? And I'm not going to go on the soapbox about teacher supply, but I think we know that well.
Oh, look,
so
yeah. And we have discussed it here.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
I'm delighted to hear that question features on the DESH inspection.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some data gathering there. Does it feature on the MLL?
I haven't seen it.
Okay.
No.
And
Yeah.
just,
No,
I wonder...
I'm going now from my memory,
Yeah.
but from my recent memory, because we just had a DESH evaluation in May, it was one of the questions that was there. How many students are on reduced timetables?
And I'm just wondering,
The data goes back to the department.
Is it something we need to look at? Has there ever been a recommendation made following a DESH inspection in relation to the reduced timetable? We suggest that. I wonder, is that, it'd be an interesting question, has the inspector ever followed through on it? I'm just
No,
I can't answer that. I don't know the
It's
answer.
a fair point, and obviously there's a lot of schools that don't have DESH status that have issues as well. And it's good that it's been gathered in DESH, but we absolutely want to make sure that in not...
I do that not in a Kilsbury style to the school, but I just feel the department is letting schools fly solo in this and giving them zero support, and quite happy not to have the data.
Absolutely.
So.
Rita.
I suppose just 2 questions that Deputy Martin had. What report is given to parents and the plan for transition? In our schools, there is a sitting down, almost like an IEP meeting, as to what is the plan to go back to school. You know, what do we do week 1, week 2, week 3? And sometimes that actually happens as a result of a suspension, who they're reintroduced into the school, and that sometimes just to say that a suspension is an alternative to get extra resources, and that's, you know, that sometimes people will take Section 29 to see what comes out of it. I suppose we would certainly welcome the whole data collection, because, you know, we're saying it's fairly widespread, but is it, and where is it, and what is it? And I think it'd be very useful to have that, because then we'd all know where we stand. I'm glad to hear of the supports that people are talking about, and I think it should be the right supports at the right time. I think sometimes that it is just, you know, the SNA is seen as a support, but sometimes it's behavioural supports, or it's something else other than that. It could be OT. So I'm really looking forward to eventually this school inclusion model, which, you know, aren't giving therapies in schools, because I am very aware of what they're doing because they're actually located in our offices, or in Kildare Education Centre actually. So it's interesting, but they're helping the teachers to help the students, which I think will be a very good model. So I'd love to see that rolled out throughout the country, and I'm dying to see this, you know, more training for schools as well. And sometimes, you know, I think parents are aware that if they're, well, some of the parents in our schools, they would be made aware of, if the reduced timetable is there, that they actually could go to a Section 29. And sometimes that's the way they go, because they know that's where the additional resources will come from.
Okay.
Which isn't right, you know.
Yeah.
It should be given, not, you know, you shouldn't have to fight for it. You should be given them.
Okay, thank you, Breda. Michael, the last word.
Thank you, Chair. I was principal in 2 DEIS schools in Dublin here over 15 years, and I did put, we came to the conclusion with parents that reduced timetables were the right approach, having gone through, as you've heard, a whole sequence of interventions up to the end. I was never happy about them. Parents were never happy about them. And the students, even though they initially thought this is great, they hate them later on. So it's very important to remember the student perspective on this is that even though it sounds like a bit of a holiday or daylight in their day, what did they do? And the answer very often is nothing, and their souls sink and their spirits sink and their engagement with life in general just dips. So there's a whole piece around what does the behaviour that can very often, and it's a recurring theme in this conversation, is that these reduced timetables are an answer to the question of a student's profound enduring misbehaviour and the consequences of that on everybody else in the classroom. But where is that coming from? And it's only now that we are beginning to really understand, get insights into behaviour and behaviour management. And I think when I was principal back in the 90s, things were fairly open and shut, but we had no real serious NBSS, for example, or NEWB support. You were on your own, really, and when you're on your own, you work out a justice to the majority rather than the individual in spite of all your best efforts. There is, if I may say, and now things are much better. In spite of a reduced pupil-teacher ratio, which has not been restored since the cuts due to the recession. May I just finish by saying that there's a worrying theme emerging in this conversation, and it's I was here before on school costs. And it was the same theme, and it's around parent power. The Constitution can say all it likes around parents being the primary educators of their children. But the power differential, when a young mother, and it's mothers more often than not, is sitting in a principal's office, the power differential is palpable. And it's something that really, really needs our serious attention. What emerges very often when things go well for the family is that the principal has given power to the parent. But in more situations, the parent needs to claim it, and they are not empowered to claim it. And that is something that is deep and profound, and it results in bad outcomes for families, for students and children and teenagers. And I think that's something that's worthy of greater attention. It's easy to be a giant in a land of pygmies, and so certain teachers or school principals or school boards even can behave like giants when in fact they don't have the constitution or indeed moral authority to be making life impacting decisions on children and on their families by extension without justification. So I think there's a justice piece to be looked at here, but certainly there's a power piece to be looked at, and we need to drill a little further into that.
Thank you, Michael. That's a point well made for us to finish on. And I'd like to thank all 8 of you for coming this morning and for presenting to us. I think that we can all be glad that we're shining a light on the subject, because I think obviously the discussion needs to be had. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be having another session on the 13th of June where we've been engaging with the Department and TUSLA amongst other organisations. And at the end of that process, we'll be discussing further and we'll be issuing a report and making recommendations. But I want to thank every one of you individually for your time and for your insights and for your practical recommendations as well. It was much appreciated. So thank you very much. Thank you. And can I ask the committee to remain, please, because we need to go into private session.